great accomplishment of Aboriginal people was to learn how to tame this fire-prone continent by the intelligent use of fire. When the British came, what they found were park-like expanses of lightly wooded pastures, and they thought that they'd found Eden, and they thought it was natural, but it wasn't natural. It was a human-made landscape.
Welcome to Sacred Land Speaks, where we dive into the audio archives of the Sacred Land Film Project and revisit the interview clips we left on the cutting room floor over 40 years of filmmaking. I'm your host, Toby McLeod. Today we bring you part one of my 2010 interview with Professor Marcia Langton, an anthropologist and geographer of Yiman and Bidjara heritage in what's now known as Australia. In 2007, I traveled to Australia's Northern Territory to film with Aboriginal communities that had secured a law protecting sacred sites, but whose traditional owners were still battling the desecration of sacred land by mining companies. As we edited the footage, it was clear that we needed to interview someone who could explain the history of the struggles we had witnessed and filmed. Marcia Langton was the perfect person. She was the Foundation Chair of Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne, and she was a fearless activist speaking out about Aboriginal land rights with a nuanced approach to mining. In 2010, Professor Langton generously gave us 2 hours of her time as she thoroughly explained the Aboriginal worldview, the particular form of settler colonialism in Australia, and the many ways the First Peoples of the land continue to resist threats and protect their homeland. With all stories, it's important to understand the historical context, and Aboriginal Australians have an exceptionally long history, as the 250 language groups and roughly 500 smaller territorial nations or clans are the longest continuously existing cultures we know of on the planet.
When you think about the figures that archaeologists give us, such as 60,000 years of human occupation on the Australian continent, it's very hard to think about what that means. It's difficult to imagine it because it's 6 times longer than the history of agricultural societies in Europe or Asia. 6 times longer. It's 6 times longer than from the beginning of civilizations to the present. 10,000 years ago, there were still people living in caves in Europe. 60,000 years ago, it's hard to imagine what it was like. We know little bits and pieces from the archaeological record. And so you have probably small groups of humans arriving on rafts of some kind, marine craft of some kind, across the Wallace Line from about Bali, Lombok onwards to Australia. That's a very deep trench. So human beings were crossing the sea to get to this continent, probably travelling around the coast and following recognisable vegetation communities, and then gradually over 60,000 years establishing societies, with the seas rising and falling with the Ice Age. What most people don't understand is that Australia was throughout this time and before a land of fire. There were wildfires, constant fires, and so one of the major adaptations human societies made on this continent early on, and there's evidence for this, was to learn to live with annual wildfires. And the way that they learnt to live with fire was by learning how to use fire. The great accomplishment of Aboriginal people was to learn how to tame this fire-prone continent by the intelligent use of fire. And when the British came, what they found were park-like expanses of lightly wooded pastures. And they thought that they'd found Eden. And they thought it was natural, but it wasn't natural. It was a human-made landscape as a result of thousands of years of annual or biannual fires. Compare that extraordinary deep history with 200 and something years of European settlement and the ecological impacts. The Murray-Darling river system is dying in many places. The salination is so extreme it's now impossible to grow anything. There's not enough water for farmers to continue, and that is a result of European settlement and unintelligent use of the land and water. Look at the way that Australians deal with fire. February before last year, there was a fire conflagration, now referred to as Black Saturday. There were more than 200 deaths, many communities utterly destroyed, reduced to white ash. And, without detracting in any way from the tragedy of it, I want to say that it's very evident that still 200 and something years later, Australians don't know how to live with fire.
Australia is vast, encompassing almost 3 million square miles, making it larger than the United States if you exclude Alaska. Many settler descendants in Australia view Aboriginal people historically as nomads, but Marcia Langton described a broad range of lifestyles, economies, and traditions, with each culture shaped by climate and the biodiversity of the local territory. Of course, the European invasion changed all that.
There's a very interesting archaeological record of Aboriginal life before British settlement, and we know that human societies on this continent changed several times over in the long period of human occupation, which is now said variously to be dated from 60,000 years before the present to, roughly 40,000 years before the present. So there are a number of dates and very good evidence for the longest human occupation of a place in the world. But at the same time, there was a great deal of change. Now, after British settlement, in some places it's very difficult to have a detailed understanding of what Aboriginal life must have been like because the impact of colonisation was so devastating and in some places rapid. But we know from the anthropological record that there were a number of different types or styles of hunter-gatherer economic ways of life. So you have, your coastal groups who depend heavily on marine resources, but also seasonally access inland resources from rivers and forests and so on. And so a highly seasonal way of life. Then you have adaptations to climate. So in the temperate zones of Australia, there was a particular way of life, and so too for the subtropical, tropical, monsoonal, the semi-arid areas, wet tropics, as opposed to the wet, dry tropics. So each of these ecological zones gave rise to different types of hunter-gatherer, fishing ways of life, and of course the climatic differences can be quite extreme as well. Australia is a very big continent, so it's not possible to speak of one Aboriginal way of life. Some groups in southern Australia were highly sedentarised, that is, they lived pretty much in one place and they had permanent settlements. We know that in some places in Victoria there were stone houses, for instance. There were irrigation channels for the capture and breeding of eels. We know in some other parts of Australia and the river systems there were fish traps, very elaborate stone fish traps, where you have tidal areas, for instance. But the hunter-gatherer fishing subsistence way of life is a particular way of life. Worldwide societies of this kind are at the same time wealthy in terms of natural resources, but vulnerable to the quirks and whims of nature. And so, say for instance in the wet, dry tropics, the wet season can be a very hard time when it's difficult to hunt. There's not much around in the vegetation communities that's edible during the wet season, and so that can be a period of relative abstinence. In the late dry season and early wet season, however, there can be, a proliferation of food sources, and so there's a great deal of feasting. In North Australia, there are said by most Aboriginal groups to be 6 seasons, so that's quite different from the 4 seasons that the Europeans and British brought here. and they're very defined seasons. And so in the public imagination, Aboriginal people are seen as nomadic peoples, but actually that's not, properly speaking, the case. Some people say semi-nomadic. It's more correct, I think, to say that Aboriginal people access different ecological zones seasonally, but were very much attached to their own traditional estates and accessed estates of neighbouring peoples according to rights acquired through marriage and various kinship relationships. And so the range over which people were able to access food and other materials might have been very large, but people had attachments to their own traditional estates. In most of the mainland, it appears that Aboriginal society had very strong patrilineal or patrimoiety structured groups, and of course that changed with the demographic impact of colonisation and the frontier violence. So with the loss of population, there was a shift in many parts from the patrimoiety-based estate-owning groups, or clans, if you want to call them that, to more cognatic or affiliation. That is, people could reckon their affiliation to estates through any one of their four grandparents. And you can imagine that, with colonisation and population removal and racial mixturing, that people would want to reckon their descent to their Aboriginal grandparents. And so if lineages were cut off by violence or disease, particularly the epidemics, then people would fall back on affiliations to place through other grandparents. So quite dramatic demographic changes. And then, of course, you have the problem that most of the Aboriginal population became sedentarised by government efforts to control the Aboriginal population by incarcerating populations in reserve areas, by the establishment of missions, and by the incorporation of Aboriginal people into labour forces for the cattle industry, for agriculture, sugarcane farming, and so on. With the institutionalisation of the Aboriginal population through various measures of control, and this started in the late 19th century and intensified through the early 20th century and really only came to an end in the 1970s and early 1980s. So for almost 100 years, the Aboriginal population was institutionalised. That institutionalisation, along with the impact of colonisation, epidemics, frontier violence, population removals, resulted in very radical changes, in most cases, to the Aboriginal economies. So you can see that in just a few events, say the gold rushes in North Queensland, the introduction of cattle herds in the Northern Territory, and similar big impact events like that, this is when the Aboriginal economies collapsed. Yeah? It's very marked. It's not a gradual collapse. In so many cases, a very sudden collapse of the Aboriginal economy. Very interesting book written by Tim Rouse, an historian, called White Flower, White Power. And he documents the radical change in diet in Central Australia, an arid zone, that the introduction of flour by missions and settlers and government officials caused in the Aboriginal population. So whereas previously women collected seeds in their coolamans, they ground the seeds in, mortar and pestle arrangements made from stones, and sometimes, whole valleys are full of these natural mortar and pestle arrangements where you can see the grooves made by women over hundreds and possibly thousands of years of grinding seeds. That whole way of life is gone pretty much overnight. And a very interesting missionary wrote an account of this. The introduction of white flour brings an end to the grass seed staples of semi-arid zone Aboriginal peoples. You can see similar events in other parts of the country. So what happens with the missions and the government settlements is that on the one hand they provide, in many cases, a safe haven from the frontier violence. They are also extremely unhealthy places. And the change of diet is, in the minds of many people, the key factor in bringing about the change from, the robustly healthy hunter-gatherer population to a population with extreme ill health. If you wanted to kind of set it out in phases, and there are very distinct phases, of course the times vary across the country: colonisation, institutional control, the impacts result in the collapse of the hunting and gathering and fishing way of life, or the subsistence economies, a change in diet, and of course white flour is distributed quite deliberately to control the population and sedentarise the population, to cause people to stay in one place to receive rations, radical drop in health, and then dependence. So that's a snapshot picture of 150 to 200 years of history across a very wide continent, with a great deal of variation as to time period and the length of time it took for these events to take place. You see, in some parts of the country, Aboriginal people didn't see their first white person till the 1940s, whereas in Sydney it was 1788. So quite extreme variations in the time period of the frontier, as well as the type of Aboriginal economy and the actual impacts of the frontier.
While Marcia Langton paints a picture of near total devastation and dependence, there were Aboriginal communities that maintained their traditional practices and connection to sacred places through the harvesting of food and performance of ceremony, and by taking youth out into country to learn place names, cultural history, and the ancestral beings associated with important places. Aboriginal people have never stopped demanding recognition of and respect for their sacred sites.
I don't want to give the impression that with the frontier came the end of Aboriginal society. That's not the case at all. Aboriginal societies have been extraordinarily resilient throughout this colonial history and post-Federation history. So there are many places in Australia where Aboriginal groups were able to maintain much of their traditional economy, lifestyle and culture. Now, in so many parts of Australia that changed radically, but that doesn't mean that Aboriginal people stopped doing things the way that they like to do them, yeah? So you might have, for instance, in most parts of rural Australia, some considerable dependence on store-bought food, but continuation of hunting and gathering practices. And Aboriginal foods are regarded as high status and they're highly prized for two reasons. One is that they have cultural meaning, and those meanings of Aboriginal foods have to do with status and attachments to place. To be able to harvest foods, to hunt foods, to fish requires skill, so there's, the demonstration of traditional skills involved, and so all of those meanings are involved in the continuation of Aboriginal food harvesting practices. Critically, the continuation of Aboriginal food harvesting practices demonstrates that people know their country, and it is a way of teaching young people about their country. And so it's very important, especially in the school holidays, in many parts of Australia, for Aboriginal families to take the children out on country, they say, and to show them how to get wild foods. Now, what happens then on these school holiday trips is that the young people are also shown the religious places in their country. So these religious places are remembered because people continue to have access to their country. And even when people were forced into the cattle industry, being in the cattle industry meant that people could retain an association with their own countries, you see. And if people lived on the coast, even if they were forced to work in the fishing industry, it meant that they got access to the sea and were able to maintain a way of life. Perhaps they only saw their country once or twice a year, but they weren't completely removed from their country or from their way of life. And so it's really, I think, extraordinary that Aboriginal people have maintained attachments to significant places across the country, be they religious places, places of historical significance, places of economic significance such as special hunting, fishing, gathering places, and to conduct a campaign across, several decades to have many of these places protected on cultural heritage registers of various kinds, or simply to force the local community to respect their wishes about places by arguing with the community, and to the point where people say, well, okay, we have to show respect for these places. So, for instance, here in Melbourne, there are many signs in the city now, public signage, acknowledging the traditional owners' place, the Wurundjeri. There are named places, there are Aboriginal walks with signs. And I've noticed that, this is increasingly the case in Darwin. When I lived in Darwin, there was no public signage of the fact that that's Larrakia country, and that all of these places still have names in Larrakia language. So now I notice that there are signs everywhere with the names of places. There are walks, there are signs that tell of the significance of a place, of historical meanings or, religious meanings. So this has changed very much in Australian life in the last 30 years. What can you say about these places in the lives of Aboriginal people? Well, to say that a place belongs to the Wurundjeri or that it belongs to the Larrakia, well, you can see already that Larrakia identity or Wurundjeri identity is tied up with the networks of places in their traditional estates. One is able to call oneself Larrakia or Wurundjeri precisely because people know about their own country. They know the names of their country. They've learnt about their cultural heritage, and that cultural heritage is very much place-based. There's a beautiful video in one of the significant public galleries here, the Ian Potter Gallery in Federation Square at the National Gallery of Victoria. In that, Joy Wandon Murphy welcomes people formally, and then she explains the significance of the country. In another video, she talks about an eagle that flies down the river. And so there are these marvellous ancestral stories that give a special kind of meaning to a place. Yeah, so people feel an association with the ancestral beings, and there's a special sentiment for a place because it's a particular kind of place that's made or shaped or imbued with the feeling or power of an eagle or some other ancestral being. This goes to make up a person's identity, their attachment to place, how they're seen by other people. These are very significant things. This is what makes people who they are and how they're seen by others. And it's, the essence of being Aboriginal, really. The meanings of places and the attachment to places, as well as the actual physical dependence on places, these all go to make up the classical understanding of being Aboriginal.
Not only do people get a sense of Aboriginal identity from place, but through sacred sites they also connect with and honour the ancestral beings who created the land.
In the Aboriginal world, there are many different kinds of sacred sites. And it could be anything. It could be a pile of rocks. It could be the mouth of a river. It could be an island. It could be a mountain. It could be a salt pan. It could be anything at all in the environment. It could be a star. It could be the way the moon travels across the sky. It could be a rock in a river. But each one of these places and of the natural phenomena associated with the places are believed by Aboriginal people who hold to Aboriginal traditions to be the emanations of revered ancestors who lived during a sacred past. And the world was made by them. And so we live in a world made by these sacred ancestors, and how we treat those places is absolutely critical to whether or not we have a good life. And indeed, what is required for Aboriginal people who follow tradition is that they should celebrate those places in the traditional forms which they are taught by their grandparents. So there'll be songs and ceremonies, knowing the stories, knowing how to behave in those places. So in some places you're not allowed to talk. You're not allowed to smoke or spit. You're not allowed to sit down. You're not allowed to camp there. In other places you can. But in order to do so, you have to be, say, for instance, smoked or baptised in water. And old people talk to the ancestors in the land, and they say things in their languages like, "Hello, this is your grandson, and I'm here with my friends, and we've come here to visit you. We won't cause any harm, and we're staying for a couple of days, and we want you to look after us." But of course it'll be something like a prayer or an invocation to the ancestor. In some parts of the country, people take the sweat from their bodies and wipe it on to the guests and make the invocation, and then the ancestral beings, who are spiritual presences in the landscape, think that the guests smell like their own children, and so they won't come to any harm. And there are all sorts of traditions like this. These places are where the real nature of the world glows and emanates, yeah? These are the places where not only people were made, but the very idea of a lineage of people was made, right? So in some places you have an ancestor who had a fight with another being and rolled and rolled and rolled around on the ground and created ripples in the landscape and threw up sand and mud and water in the fight and went into the ground, and there was the language, the people, the valley, the environment, all created in that sacred drama. And so Aboriginal people believe they are descended from those beings and those events, and the world that they live in was shaped by them. So that's what they believe. And they can't, therefore, dishonour that part of their own way of being in this world. It's how they believe the world works. And to go against that blueprint is to cause the destruction of your own being, your own world, your own family, and the world of your descendants. Aboriginal people who follow the old traditions believe that those places are where the presence of the ancestors remains forever. That is where the ancestors live. Now, not all sites are like that, but the most important sites are the places where the ancestral beings remain in that place. That's where they live, and they live there forever. There are other places where their presence is, say, an emanation from an event in the sacred drama of the ancestral being, but it's not where the ancestral being lives. The most important places are where the ancestral beings live.
In the 4th episode of our Standing on Sacred Ground film series, Islands of Sanctuary, we tell the story of the Gidangji community, which was fighting against a plan to move the MacArthur River to make way for an open-pit zinc mine. The community was outraged about this threat to the river because one of those important ancestral beings, the rainbow serpent, lives there. I asked Marcia Langton if she could help me understand the rainbow serpent.
From most places in Australia, there's a story of a rainbow serpent. Rainbow serpents are depicted in Aboriginal art as giant snake-like or eel-like creatures with heads like dragons, and it's told in all the stories that they live underwater. And during the sacred past, they moved around the landscape and created the valleys and the mountains. And wherever there is a rainbow serpent story, and these stories are in New South Wales, they're in Queensland, they're in the Northern Territory, there are serpent stories in Western Australia as well, there is always a sacred water place where people believe that the rainbow serpent continues to live. And so there are rainbow serpent places all over the continent. And they're believed by Aboriginal people to be very powerful places because the rainbow serpent is, in the higher order of ancestral beings, a very powerful creature with a very powerful presence in the world today. In all of the stories that Aboriginal people tell about the rainbow serpent, there's always a set of rules about how one approaches rainbow serpent places. So, for instance, one must go with a senior traditional owner. These are usually very dangerous places because the rainbow serpent is a very dangerous creature. One's health and well-being and ability to prosper in the world is all put at risk in the presence of a rainbow serpent. And so people say that the traditions must be followed. And this is what I mean by all of those rituals that people perform in places to make people safe in the presence of these dangerous presences.
When they arrived in Australia, English settlers declared the giant continent terra nullius, no man's land, belonging to no one. The newcomers were blind to the thousands of sacred natural sites revered by Aboriginal people, and as the native people defended their country, they were massacred or imprisoned. Meanwhile, British law precluded treaties. It was not until the 1990s that Aboriginal land rights were finally recognized in court, and the doctrine of terra nullius was overturned. Professor Langton's account of this history is complex and detailed, and hopefully will be of interest to everyone from law students to land rights advocates.
Terra nullius is the Latin term for a British legal doctrine which is set out in Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, published in 1832. It is the doctrine of ceded colonies. So during the age of imperialism, the British legal philosophers invented the theory that there were conquered colonies and ceded colonies. Now, in conquered colonies, treaties could be made with the natives. In ceded colonies, treaties could not be made because terra nullius implies an empty land, a land without people, or a land without people with whom one could make a treaty. And so Aboriginal people were regarded by Australian courts as being so primitive as to be incapable of making a treaty. So that was the decision of Blackburn in the Millerpum case against the Nabalco Mining Company in northeast Arnhem Land in 1968. That's when the terra nullius doctrine was applied, and it applied retrospectively as a result of that case throughout Australian history. Aboriginal people could not have known that in 1770, Captain Cook declared the east coast of Australia British possession. He did so on an island which he named Possession Island in the Torres Straits. And thereafter, according to British law, Aboriginal people were no longer the owners of their land. In the 1960s, bauxite was discovered in northeast Arnhem Land. When the traditional owners of the area found out that a lease to the mining company had been imposed over their land, they went to court. And they had a very clever Queen's Counsel argue the case for them in the Northern Territory Supreme Court. His name was Edward Woodward. He argued to the court from 1965 onwards that Aboriginal people of the area, and he named the clans and he provided various kinds of evidence, owned the land and had inalienable rights in the land that could not be taken away from them. And he showed how the Aboriginal land tenure system worked on the basis of not only his own understanding from interviewing his clients, but also expert anthropologists. Now, the judge found against the Aboriginal people, but the judge had to say that the case for there being Aboriginal laws that governed ownership of land existed, and the evidence was very strong. But under British law, and he relied on Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, 1832, held that in ceded colonies, the coloniser was the new owner because in ceded colonies there were no people to make treaties with. And Australia, he declared, was a ceded colony. And this is essentially the terra nullius argument. Australia is not unique because Western Sahara was also terra nullius, but in Australia it was the 1992 Mabo case before the High Court, which resulted in the terra nullius doctrine being overturned in Australian law. When Mr Koiki Mabo took a case eventually after at least a decade through the Queensland courts to the High Court of Australia, arguing just as the Yolngu people had done in the Milliprum case, that he inherited his land traditionally and that what he inherited was a native title, and that native title could be proved in the Torres Straits, which was his traditional country. It could be proved, he said, because there was a rent receipt from the British and there was much other evidence. The High Court agreed with Mr Mabo and said, yes, there is native title, and the High Court overturned the doctrine of terra nullius and said that such a doctrine does not belong in the laws of modern Australia. And the High Court ruled that native title as it existed prior to British settlement, that is, the laws of the local peoples, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, survived British sovereignty and continued wherever Crown titles did not wipe out the Aboriginal titles. So it was quite a difficult court ruling then to translate into an Act of Parliament. And there were 2 years of negotiations to translate the High Court decision into an Act of Parliament. The Native Title Act did two things. One, it protects native title where it survives, that is, where it has not been wiped out by a valid historical grant of title by the Crown. So native title survives wherever there is no valid post-colonial title, such as a freehold title or a leasehold. From October 31st, 1975, Australia was a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And with the Racial Discrimination Act applying in Australia from 1975, as a Commonwealth Act, it overrode all acts of racism by any government. So therefore, the state governments and the Commonwealth could no longer issue titles that extinguish native title. There was the problem that from 1975 to what effectively became the time of negotiations, or the passing of the new Act in 1994, a period when all titles in Australia were racially discriminatory because they extinguished native title without regard to the native title holders. And so the Native Title Act validates all of those titles without the need for compensation. So therefore, the Australian land title system was brought into line with the Native Title Act, and the Native Title Act protected surviving native title and established an administrative and legal regime for dealing with conflicts between the Crown, applicants to the Crown, and native title claimants and holders. So now we have a native title legal regime which involves Aboriginal people in land use and land titling. And there have been native title determinations which have returned title to many Aboriginal groups, although there's an outstanding list of native title claims of some length and a long way to go yet. But it's a small measure of justice, and to some extent it works, and importantly, it allows Aboriginal people to have the right to negotiate in many circumstances. So really, until 1992, Aboriginal people had no inherent rights as the original owners of the land. And the law went entirely against Aboriginal people. British law went against Aboriginal people in every respect until the 20th century.
The British colonized territories in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, North America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific Islands. Marcia Langton told me about the unique approach the English took in Australia as they discovered it to be a vast, populated continent.
Britain colonised Australia at around the time of the War of Independence in America. So there were two factors that collide in history. One is the War of Independence and the refusal of the Americans to accept British colonisation and British convicts. So on the Thames River in London, the convicts were piling up in the hulls along the river. There were hundreds of convicts imprisoned on hulls, and there was nowhere for the hulls to go. The British Home Office put a couple of decades of work into figuring out what to do with all the people locked up, because the prisons were full, the poorhouses were full, the hulls were full. They thought about a colony in Africa to send the convicts to, and because of Captain Cook's explorations of the east coast of Australia and a few notes that he made about a place called Port Jackson, which is now Sydney, although he never did enter the harbour, the British identified Port Jackson as a potential penal colony for the disposal of all the convicts that had accumulated in their hulls because of the War of Independence in America. So Captain Cook explored the east coast of Australia in 1770 and then, of course, went on to the Sandwich Islands or Hawaii and through the Pacific. Of course, Hawaii is where he died, the Sandwich Islands. But when the British sent out the first fleet of 11 ships with the convicts in 1788, they arrived at Botany Bay, and Cook's notes on the place were incorrect. So it was difficult to find fresh water. There was a lot of marshland. It was not a suitable place for a settlement. So a boat was sent around to Port Jackson to find out what was there. And they found a suitable place, and that's, the Circular Quay area now, where the ferries pull in. And that happened overnight, and then they brought the 11 ships around, and over the next few days to a week unloaded 1,100 convicts. And so they had orders from King George III to make friends with the natives. And for the first few years that went passably well, but turned to violence. And by the early 1800s, there were 4 war fronts around Sydney. And from then on, the frontiers were extremely violent. But in Victoria, there were no convicts, and the free settlers here brought in thousands and thousands of sheep, and the impact of stock was very dramatic. So within a year, Victorian Aboriginal people were starving because the sheep ate all the grass, and there was no grass for the wallabies, the kangaroos, and there was no place for them to hunt. So it happened so quickly in Victoria. As the settler population spread out of the first penal colonies or ports, the first impacts were tree clearing and the impact of large herds of cattle or sheep. So you have the destruction of forests and the impact of hard-hoofed animals on an environment where there were no hard-hoofed animals previously, along with frontier violence in many cases and epidemics such as smallpox, measles, influenza. The land grabs proceeded basically block by block. Each settler would mark out a large block of land. There were hundreds and then thousands of these settlers, and so it was like a jigsaw puzzle in fast motion, moving out from the penal colonies and ports. Within 100 years, all of New South Wales was taken up. There might be tiny slithers of land or the tops of mountain ranges or the rivers where there was no imprint of the settler, but everything else had been taken by the settler. It happened most quickly in New South Wales and Victoria and in southern Queensland. There was an economic collapse, a depression in the 1890s. The goldfields were terribly destructive of Aboriginal life, and then by the 1930s, anthropologists are reporting very small numbers of Aboriginal people remaining. And then by the 1940s, the remnant Aboriginal populations were then governed by the Department of Native Affairs administrators and missions. The missionaries came after the frontier usually. There were a few odd groups along with the frontiers, but mostly the missions came just as the frontiers had done their worst. They were paid by the colonial governments to administer rations and to administer the remnant populations in reserved areas. So it wasn't really the missionaries who caused destruction. A lot of people blame them for the destruction of Aboriginal culture, but in so many cases the reverse is the case. Many of the missionaries learnt Aboriginal languages and taught them in the schools. If that were not the case in Victoria, then it's justifiable that Aboriginal people in Victoria have a very poor view of the missions. There were, even from 1788, a variety of views. Reverend Samuel Marsden, the Anglican chaplain to the colony, declared that Aboriginal people did not have souls. And of course the Catholics weren't allowed to minister the colony until much, much later. Others, particularly the evangelists, regarded Aboriginal people as having souls, so there were disputes. The general view, except for the evangelists, was that Aboriginal people were pests, vermin, and this view justified the various attempts to eliminate local populations. But in many parts of the country, the missions actually preserved Aboriginal culture, and the experience of Victorians is not the case everywhere else in the country. It's still the case today that people have written languages as a result of working with the missionaries to translate the Bible, the hymn books and other documents into their own languages, and that's strengthened their languages so that their languages continue to be used in everyday life and in a literate form in classrooms and other events. The number of languages that disappeared could be about 200 and rising. So it was a highly destructive process of colonisation, and the demographic changes were extreme. The population probably dropped by about 80% by the 1930s, from 1788 to the 1930s, and then in the late 20th century you have a pretty fast growth of the Aboriginal population. Our population now has the reverse configuration of the Australian population. That is, very few old people left in our population. 60% is under the age of 25. Whereas in the rest of the Australian population, an increasing number of older people and very low rates of natural increase. But the Aboriginal population is the reverse.
As we've learned in the United States, it's difficult to come to terms with the brutal history of settler colonialism. I asked Marcia Langton how Australia is grappling with its past.
When one thinks about the age of imperialism, when the European nations sent their navies and armies and officials around the world and divided up the continents into coloured zones, so that, for instance, the British owned all the red bits on the map, which was the vast majority of the planet. We have to today think about the arrogance and inhumanity of the logic. European powers declared ownership over other people's lands and enslaved peoples around the world or destroyed them. And that process started 500 and something years ago. Modern Australia is the result of that history. And like South Africa, the United States, Canada, New Zealand and some other countries, Australia is a settler state. The modern nation started life as a series of British colonies, and their existence as colonies was based on the denial of humanity to Aboriginal people, the Aboriginal peoples and the Torres Strait Islander peoples who lived here before the British came for thousands of years. How can modern Australia purport to be a member of the Commonwealth of Nations or the Community of Nations observing human rights law if it continues to abuse Aboriginal people and deny their humanity? So it's a running sore in the history of modern Australia. And gradually, governments have changed their views, and gradually they have recognised, through acts of parliament and policies, the humanity of Indigenous people. And as they do so, they realise that all of the foreboding about what would happen to their way of life if Aboriginal people were accepted into their community as citizens, different but equal citizens did not come to pass. There was no downside. It's worked out rather well, in fact. And Australians, whether they are aware of it or not, take Aboriginal culture with them into their homes and into their parliaments, and they can't escape from the influence of the Aboriginal world on their lives. The result is a modern nation that is based on an honourable relationship with its first owners, and not the ugly relationship based on the theft of the land from the first owners. So everybody wins. When you recognise other people's humanity, everybody wins.
Marcia Langton's analysis was crucial to telling the story of Aboriginal people fighting to protect their sacred sites in the Islands of Sanctuary episode of our Standing on Sacred Ground series. You can find a link to the film on our website, sacredland.org, where you can also learn more about our films, resources, and suggested actions you can take to protect sacred places. Tune into the next episode of Sacred Land Speaks for part 2 of my interview with Marcia Langton, where she shares contemporary stories of the Aboriginal land rights movement, the often tense negotiations with mining companies, and how Aboriginal Australians finally received an apology from the government. If you like what you've heard, please rate and subscribe to Sacred Land Speaks on your favorite podcast app. This episode was produced and written by Callie, Shanafelt, Wong, and Toby McLeod. Our interview with Marcia Langton was recorded by Andy Black and Dave Wendlinger. Our theme music was composed and performed by Stefan Smith and Charles Johnson. Sacred Land Speaks is brought to you by the Sacred Land Film Project of Earth Island Institute, based in the Lejeune-Ohlone territory of Hoochyoon, otherwise known as Berkeley, California. Thanks for joining us.